Hello, I'm State Representative Pam Byrnes, and I represent the 52nd House District in the Michigan House of Representatives. Welcome to Capitol Update with Representative Pam Byrnes. This is my public affairs show that brings the people of Washtenaw County the news and views from our state capitol. Today we're going to discuss Transition Ann Arbor, a movement that is focused on bringing the community together to transition to life beyond oil and create a more self-sufficient society. My guest today is Nathan Ayers of Transition Ann Arbor. Welcome to the show, Nathan.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, this is certainly a timely topic when we're talking about energy efficiency and energy conservation. But could you just explain to me and to the viewers what Transition Ann Arbor is?
Sure. So Transition Ann Arbor is actually part of a larger international movement of communities, cities, municipalities that are starting to come together and take responsibility for their food, energy, transportation needs.
So it's an all-encompassing concept?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like an ecosystem?
Well, when we start to look at the needs of any, modern society, we start to think about food, water, transportation, energy to power our homes and things like that. And there's a tremendous amount of waste and things like that that we don't need involved in the system. And what Transition really hopes to sort of aim and bring to attention is that all of those systems we're talking about are really dependent on mass amounts of cheap fossil fuels. So it's about how we can make this transition from sort of these non-renewable, finite resources, petroleum, coal, and things like that, towards more renewable, sustainable, resilient, community-based programs.
So how did this transition movement start? You said it's a national movement. How did it get started?
Yeah, so it actually began in Great Britain, and Great Britain's neighbor Ireland. In 2006, there was a British man named Rob Hopkins who was teaching a permaculture design course at a community college there in Ireland. And part of his class that he was teaching was for these students to come up with an energy descent action plan for the village of Kinsale, which is where they were teaching this in Ireland. And the students came up with this really in-depth sort of 25-year vision about how this village could successfully sort of climb their way down an energy descent. And it was so good that the city council there in that city decided to adopt it and begin implementing these changes.
Wow, so it's already become a reality then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So after these these students presented this stuff and the city adopted it, Rob goes back to Great Britain, to a little town called Totnes, and he's like, I think I'm onto something here. And he starts this transition town movement, which is really, as I mentioned before, all about this transition from sort of oil dependency towards local resilience.
What other cities or communities have this transition program in the United States?
In the United States, we're up to approximately 65 official transition towns. The first one happened in Boulder, Colorado. And then there's a handful of others all throughout the entire United States. Ann Arbor, where we're at, was the 26th official transition town in the U.S. But then worked into the model, there's room for sort of communities and cities that are interested in pursuing a lot of these methods of energy descent to start collecting their resources, and that's what's known as mulling. So there are hundreds of towns all over the U.S. that are in this mulling stage of transition. So
like for Transition Ann Arbor, does that mean it would go beyond, let's say, the city limits to incorporate more of the county areas? Well, that's an interesting framing. What we've noticed as we've been working on a lot of these issues is that no two transition towns are identical. So Ann Arbor, within Washtenaw County, we have a lot of close relationships with Saline, Chelsea, Ypsilanti, places like that. And so we're constantly in communication about how we can better improve our food security and energy efficiency. And it's really important to, have an understanding of the circle that encompasses any locale. But that being said, we are transitioning Ann Arbor. It's tough for us to really focus on what's going on in Tallahassee or things like that. We're focused on local issues and things that immediately affect Ann Arbor and its communities. And the resources vary from community to community as well. Absolutely. Whether natural resources or the environment or what you have to work with. Sure. Even just organizational resources. A town like Ann Arbor, there are people who have been in organizations that have been working on these issues for a number of years when we're talking about food and energy efficiency and things like that. So we're really lucky to be in a place like Ann Arbor starting up because there are so many resources available to an organization that's in the midst of sort of trying to promote this transition. So would Transition Ann Arbor be kind of like an umbrella over all these various organizations, whether it's local foods or energy, to try and coordinate all those efforts?
It's a question we get asked a lot, and it's something we need to be very careful about, because one of the last things we want to try and be is an umbrella organization. As I mentioned, there are people that have been working on these kinds of things for decades, and for some organization that's new to come into town and say, hey, we're the new boss in town, you guys are all going to be sort of working underneath us, that's a big no-no.
Yeah.
So we want to be very mindful. One of the things that we like to sort of implement in transition is this notion of sort of cultivate and collaborate, where we can really sort of collect the dots about what's going on locally in terms of food, energy, water, transportation, and then connect the dots so we can sort of plug like-minded organizations into each other's work, share data, things like that. But the last thing that we try and be is an umbrella.
Okay. So how about giving us some examples of what Transition Ann Arbor has done, and how long you've been around, and just a little bit about what you're involved with?
Yeah, so how we got started is there's a handful of wonderful women in Ann Arbor that ended up bringing in the founders from Transition Boulder to do a 2-day training in Ann Arbor.
Okay.
And this was in February of 2009. And after this 2-day training, it was really successful. It sold out. All 50 seats were spoken for. There was an initiating group that was formed, which is sort of one of the first steps in any one of these transition towns, is to form an initiating committee. So it was myself and 5 other women that formed this initiating committee, and really one of the first things that we embarked on is just awareness raising. And that's a huge first step, because one of the sort of key tenets and principles about transition is this sort of uncomfortable topic that's known as the long emergency.
The what?
The long emergency.
The long emergency.
And the long emergency is really this triumvirate of 3 sort of distinct crises that we're able to see are sort of barreling our way. And those crises are peak oil, climate change, and economic instability. So one of the things that we've really been working on over this past year is how we can raise awareness, whether that be through speaking engagements, movie series, community involvement, just to sort of educate the public and raise awareness about these pretty serious issues that, if we don't start to address in the near future, could have some significant impacts on our comfort and our way of life.
So how about if we go through those 3 areas that you just discussed? Let's talk about peak oil. What is peak oil?
Peak oil, yes, a contentious topic indeed. Peak oil was sort of first hypothesized in the 1950s by Dr. M. King Hubbert, who had the foresight to see that oil, petroleum, is a non-renewable resource. It's a finite resource, exactly. There's a limited amount of it that remains in the ground. And what he was able to sort of predict is that we will reach a point in history where we reach a maximum peak of production. And what that means is, when we get to that peak, you can think about a sort of a modern bell curve. The peak of peak oil is the top of that curve. And that's when we've sort of extracted half of the world's available petroleum out of the ground. So you could be thinking to yourself, well, we've extracted half. That's fine. We still have halfway to go. The problem is that we've already sort of picked the low-lying fruit, so to speak. The first half of oil was the easiest to get out of the ground. And where we're at now is we're starting to get into these very heavy energy-intensive methods like tar sand extraction and coal shale and things like that that are very energy intensive and very destructive to the environment, and actually a lot more expensive to get oil out of the ground. So the problem is that, especially when we're getting into a sort of modern industrialized economy that's spreading throughout the world in places like India and China, the demand for oil is going through the roof. And what we're seeing is that the supply, the remaining supply, is not only dwindling, but the methods of getting this oil are becoming almost prohibitively expensive. And when we start to look at what I mentioned before, you know, these areas of our life like food, energy, water, and transportation, they're completely dependent on mass amounts of cheap fossil fuel. That's how our systems were burned. And so when we get to this point where energy becomes, you know, prohibitively expensive, or God forbid we get to a point where it takes more energy than a barrel of oil to extract a barrel of oil, we're going to see production come screeching to a halt. And so these are some of the things that transition tries to sort of see ahead and say, what are the areas of life that we can start to make a gradual, sort of graceful energy descent in advance of peak oil.
So